Hi, my name's Dr. Lydia Furse, and I'm a historian working with the World Rugby Museum. Did you know that when rugby football started in 1823, people thought that only boys and men should play? So who were the first women to play rugby? Well, there's actually two candidates, both in 1887. A 10-year-old girl named Emily Valentine joined in with her brothers when their school team was a player short, even though girls usually weren't allowed to play rugby. Secondly, in Hull in the north of England, two women's teams played against each other, but the crowds were not amused and invaded the pitch before the game could be finished. While neither example truly represents the origins of women's rugby, both do suggest that in 1887, women were willing and interested in participating in traditionally masculine activities. Women in New Zealand had the same idea, and in 1891, Nita Webb planned to form a professional women's rugby team. She wanted to tour Australia and Great Britain, but there was a lot of opposition to her plan because playing rugby was considered unwomanly. Nita Webb argued that if women could be doctors and lawyers, then they could play rugby, but ultimately her team never got to play. However, in 1893, New Zealand women were the first in the world to gain the right to vote. Victorian ideas of masculinity and femininity stopped more women from playing rugby, but the First World War dramatically changed society. Often, women replaced men in factory jobs, including in the new ammunition factories. Young women took up these dangerous jobs making explosives because they were paid well. And often factory owners allowed workers to form sports teams to keep up morale. This is 17-year-old Furse Dunn, who, along with her colleagues in South Wales, formed women's rugby teams and played in order to raise money for charity. At one event, these women raised £100,000, enough to buy a submarine. This is Furse Dunn, right here. However, when the war was over, Furse Dunn and her teammates lost their factory jobs and their chance to play rugby. While the women in Wales lost their chance to play rugby, in France the sport became really popular during the 1920s. In 1922, a woman called Dr. Marie Houdray adapted the rules of rugby to create a new version, especially for women, called barrette. Barrette became really popular in Paris, even though the French Rugby Federation tried to ban it. Dr. Marie Houdray thought that women playing rugby would prove how strong and capable women are and would convince the French government to allow women the right to vote. However, France became more socially conservative during the 1930s, and the funding and support for women's sports, particularly physical team sports like rugby and football, disappeared. None of these early examples started women's rugby as we know the game today. Instead, the game emerged during the 1970s at universities, particularly in the United States, Canada, and France. Women in the US who set up rugby teams faced less discrimination because rugby was not a popular men's sport, and these teams inspired women in other countries where rugby was more traditional men's sport. Soon, enough countries were playing for a Women's Rugby World Cup to be held in 1991. Although men's rugby organisations were initially dismissive and even tried to cancel the Women's Rugby World Cup in 1994, the women's rugby players persisted, and their determination convinced the International Rugby Board to officially recognise women's rugby. Indeed, without women, rugby would never have become an Olympic sport, because the Olympics decided, from 1991, that all new sports needed to have events for both men and women. The first Olympic Rugby Sevens tournament took place at Rio in 2016, and since then, Olympic rugby has spread the sport around the world. Now, girls and boys can aspire to be Olympic rugby athletes. If you've been inspired by the history of women's rugby, you can find out more at the World Rugby Museum or by reading stories online. How would you feel if somebody told you you couldn't do something fun just because you were a girl or a boy?